All right, guys, so we're going to keep it going. I thought I'd stick my face in here today because I do have a story to tell, and maybe if you see my face, it'll make it easier to understand. So we know that they just had a horrible, horrible winter at Valley Forge. Cold, miserable, illness spreading through. 1 out of every 4 of Washington's men died that winter. However, that was a winter when 2 really important people came into the lives of the Continental Army. One was the French ray of sunshine, the Marquis de Lafayette, who became Washington's BFF. And then there was the German Baron Friedrich von Steuben, who spent that winter kind of against the will of the soldiers, turning Washington's hot mess of an army into a well-oiled machine. So they will be going into the last part of this war as a much better army. So the question comes, did slaves fight in the war? And it's a really important question. So in 1776, that was a year into the Revolutionary War, the year that the Declaration of Independence was signed. 1/5 of the population of people living in the colonies were slaves. It means 1 out of every 5 people living in the colonies was a slave. About 500,000, 500,000 slaves in the colonies during the Revolutionary War. And that's important because one of the things that Washington is really lacking in this war that gives him a disadvantage is bodies to fight. We know that at any one time he only had 10,000 men. Sometimes he was low as 1,000 men in the Continental Army, where KG3 had not only his professional soldiers, he had Native Americans, and of course the 18,000 Hessian soldiers that he purchased. So did slaves fight in the war? Well, at the beginning of the war, it was actually against the law for a slave to fight. But Washington realized that allowing slaves to fight could mean more bodies in his army. So that winter in Valley Forge, George Washington decided to eliminate the ban on Africans fighting in the Continental Army. Basically, he allowed African Americans to fight and even promised slaves their freedom if they chose to fight for the Continental Army, and the Continental Army won the war. It's a pretty big deal. But, that's a problem because my face is there. I wonder if I can move this. Woo, I can. But General Gage, actually around the same time, promised the same thing. He promised slaves their freedom if they chose to fight for the British Army, and the British Army won. So, put that back. That might be a problem as I go through. So which side did the slaves choose? Well, you have to remember that a slave would only be set free if the side that they chose to fight for won the war. And if you think about, we know who does win the war. We know the end of the story. But if you think about it in the middle of the Revolutionary War, who's more likely to win this war? Who's been winning battle after battle? Who has every advantage? And that's the British. And so because the British had a better chance of winning the war, most slaves who chose to fight with the British. In fact, as if the British didn't have enough help, tens of thousands of slaves ended up joining the British, assuming the British would win and that the slaves would then gain their freedom. Only about 5,000 slaves chose to fight with the Continental Army, which, that sounds like a lot less compared to the British, but think about where Washington's coming from. Every little bit helps. So after the winter at Valley Forge, our help finally arrives. Spain and France arrive, France with their thousands of soldiers, their navy, and their supplies. But they don't just want to dive into something without really planning things out, because they don't just want to win a battle. They want this war to end. And so whatever they do has to be decisive. It has to be big. And so they take a little time to plan out their next move. In the meantime, the war goes on. And at this point of the war, the fighting's going to move. Right now, the fighting's kind of been happening up in the New England colonies, maybe a little bit of the middle colonies as well, but really hasn't been down in the South at all. And that's going to change at this part of the war. KG3 decides, listen, we're not doing so great. We should have destroyed the Continental Army a year into this war. I can't believe we are this far in and we still haven't crushed them. So KG3 says, listen, let's just try something totally brand new. Let's send the fighting down into the southern colonies. And this is a good place for the British to be, because there's a lot of loyalists down in the South, because down in the South they're growing cash crops and they depend on England to buy their cash crops. There's a lot more loyalists down in the South. And so KG3 sends General Cornwallis, one of his head generals, with his army down into the South, basically to kind of destroy, take over, and just kind of show these Americans who's boss. And so George Washington, I'm going to send myself up here, George Washington is going to send an army after him. So he is going to send down into the southern colonies down here. He is going to send this guy, our friend Granny Gates. And Granny Gates, wants nothing more than to prove himself, to make sure everyone knows how awesome he is. And so he's going to march his men after Cornwallis. Now, problem is, we are just coming off of this terrible winter at Valley Forge. And while Baron Friedrich von Steuben trained the army, they are still tired, they're exhausted. But General Horatio Gates, Granny Gates, forces his men to march quickly after British General Cornwallis. To make matters worse, along the way, these starving men, they're still hungry, find these green fruits along the side of the road, and being starving, Granny Gates's men kind of chow down on these green fruits. And believe it or not, these fruits were actually peaches. And if you know anything about peaches, they shouldn't be green. The reason that they were green is they were unripe. And if you know anything about eating unripened fruit, it doesn't do very good things to your digestive system. And so not only are Granny Gates' soldiers tired and hungry, now they are sick as can be. But Granny Gates has no sympathy for them. He forces his men on to attack General Cornwallis. And they meet up with General Cornwallis's army, and they have this battle. And it was a very I'm shaking my knees here. It was a very one-sided battle. General Cornwallis and the British crushed Granny Gates and the Continental Army. It was an easy victory. Again, the Americans were tired and hungry and now sick as can be. And this battle was so horrific for the American army that Granny Gates, now this is a guy who says that Washington should not be the leader of the Continental Army, that he should be in charge. Granny Gates actually abandons his army and flees and runs away. Now, obviously, that is not someone who is showing good leadership. And quickly, Washington finds out, and he says, Granny Gates, you are done. Like, no more are you part of this army at all. And Congress agrees. And so we still need to go after Cornwallis in the South. Granny Gates is not going to be able to lead his army anymore. And so Washington is going to send this guy. His name is General Nathaniel Greene, and you may have heard of him in the Liberty's Kids episode about Valley Forge. He was out getting supplies for the Continental Army, but General Nathaniel Greene goes down in place of Granny Gates, and thank goodness he does, because he realizes, Granny Gates thought, oh, I'm going to be able to outfight the British. No, you're not. Nathaniel Greene realizes if we can't outfight them, we need to outsmart them. And so basically, here's what he does. He does this little thing that I call the tap, run technique. Basically, what's going to happen is Nathaniel Greene is going to kind of go up to Cornwallis's army, get their attention, skirmish and fight a little bit, but then run. And of course, he's hoping, as he does, that General Cornwallis and his army are going to chase after him. But General Cornwallis and his army, they have a lot of supplies, and so they're not, and a lot more men. So it takes them a little bit longer, and it's a little bit harder for them to chase them. So then every now and again, Nathaniel Greene stops, fight, run, right? And every so often, it's a little bit of fight, run. And the goal that Nathaniel Greene has is he's trying to tire out Cornwallis and his army. He's trying to exhaust them because he feels like that's the only way he's going to have a shot. One of my favorite parts of this story is, one of the times that Nathaniel Greene's army is kind of running away, General Cornwallis is frustrated by how slowly their army is able to follow them because of all the supplies they have to lug with them. And so he orders his men to leave his supplies behind and go after Nathaniel Greene and his army. Well, Nathaniel Greene sends some men around the backside and gathers some of the British supplies, which was pretty awesome. Now, eventually, after, weeks and weeks, maybe months of this fight run technique that Nathaniel Greene has to tire out Cornwallis and the British army, it works. And Cornwallis and his army are exhausted. And Cornwallis decides he's going to hunker down in a town and just take a break. And he chooses a town. I didn't make a slide for it. I should have. He chooses a town in Virginia, right along the Chesapeake Bay. And this town is called Yorktown. I'm going to go back to the slide real quick, or excuse me, back to the map here and show you where Yorktown is. Yorktown is in Virginia, right along the Chesapeake Bay. And Cornwallis chooses this spot kind of wisely. Like there's a town called Yorktown that he can kind of hunker down in and rest. This town is a great choice because it is along the Chesapeake Bay. If he is attacked by the American army by land, he and his army can escape by water. And if he is attacked by water, because he knows that the French Navy has come, then he can escape by land. And so he chooses the town of Yorktown pretty wisely. And this is actually going to directly lead to the next and pretty much last major event of the Revolutionary War, and that is the Battle of Yorktown. And it will be during this battle, and I'm kind of telling you how it ends before I tell you the details, that General Cornwallis and the British will surrender. And they're not just going to surrender the battle. After this victory for the Continental Army, KG-III realizes because the French are now there to help, it's time to surrender the war. And so this will be the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. Cornwallis will surrender at the Battle of Yorktown. So I'm going to do the next video to explain the Battle of Yorktown a little bit, and then you'll see the Battle of Yorktown Liberties, kids. So enjoy. I don't know how to get rid of this.